Lessons from John Henrik Clarke and Sarah Max Stacks. Thank you for the opportunity to work through a short story by Dr. John Henrik Clarke that kind of confounded me the first time I encountered it in 2021. Dr. Clarke is often cited for his historical writings, but I don't often hear discussions regarding his contributions to literature. He wrote at least a dozen short stories, which were published in periodicals such as Opportunity, The Crisis, Harlem Quarterly, Freedom Ways, the Journal of Negro Education, and Phylon. In addition to his own creative writing, Dr. Clarke was an accomplished literary editor. He edited American Negro Short Stories, The Confessions of Nat Turner, and The Second Crucifixion of Nat Turner. When his stories are cited, people usually remember The Boy Who Painted Christ Black, which appeared in Opportunity in 1940 but has also been republished in literary anthologies. Now, in 1963, Freedom Ways published a volume that was titled Harlem, A Community in Transition, which contained a submission by Dr. Clarke titled Revolt of the Angels. Across the U.S., 1963 was fraught with civil disobedience, civil unrest, and demands for civil and human rights, and terroristic responses to those demands. To provide some context, some of the events that surrounded the release of the summer volume include May 2nd, the Children's Crusade, with the iconic images of those 1,000 students who left their schools and marched daily for almost a week for civil and human rights in Birmingham, Alabama. And then, under the orders of Bull Connor, officials blasted those students with high powered fire hoses and attacked them using police dogs. In that same month, Martin Luther King Jr. would pen his letter from Birmingham jail. And also in the same month, students and faculty from Tougaloo sit in at Woolworth's lunch counter in Jackson, Mississippi. The next month, the Council of Federated Organizations had several activists, including Fannie Lou Hamer, who were traveling by bus from the SCLC Citizenship School in South Carolina, and they were arrested and beaten in a jail in Mississippi, Winona Jail. In that same month, Medgar Evers is assassinated. In August, W.E.B. Du Bois transitions in Accra at the age of 95, and that happens on the eve of the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom held in Washington, D.C. And then in the next month, September, the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing in Birmingham, Alabama occurs. These are just a few mentions of events occurring before and after the Summer Freedom Ways volume is published. At Freedom Ways from 1962 to about 1983, about 21 years, Dr. Clarke worked as an editor and a creative alongside other contributors and activists like Shirley Graham, like W. Alphaeus Hunton, like Margaret G. Burroughs and John Devine, who were art editors, and Esther Jackson. So the first arrow is pointing to Dr. Clarke's name listed on the editor's page. The second arrow points to his short story in this volume, Revolt of the Angels, a short story. And then the third arrow is pointing to a book review that he contributed as well. And you can see here from the table of contents the list of contributors to this volume, notable people like Langston Hughes, James Baldwin, Jean Blackwell Hudson, the librarian at the Schomburg, Kenneth B. Clarke, Sterling Brown, among many others. So I discover Clarke's Revolt of the Angels in Talk That Talk, an anthology of African American storytelling edited by Linda Goss and Marion E. Barnes. And that anthology was published in 1989. I was preparing to record a new episode of Sarah Mack's Stacks on YouTube. Now, Sarah Mack's Stacks began as a journey into my father's mother's library. Shortly after she transitioned in March 2013, I rescued about 250 books from her collection that were bound for either estate sale or the dumpster. There were coffee table books and biographies, history, sociology, literature, a lot of literature, culture, religion, and the arts. The recordings were and maybe still are my attempt to be in dialogue with her through her glosses and notes and to talk about the books with others. So you see on this slide, I have listed 9 episodes that were recorded in 2020 and 2021. And the first episode is how does one go about building a library? And you'll see a number of literary selections, coffee table book. My grandmother loved Marian Anderson, so definitely her autobiography is here. And Revolt of the Angels in Talk That Talk was supposed to be the 10th episode. Now, Revolt of the Angels is set in Harlem, and it involves a satirical take on the devout members of Father Divine's peace mission movement. There is a man named Luther who disrupts the setting at Father Divine's table in one of his restaurants. And you can see these wonderful illustrations that were done by Tom Feelings to kind of take us through visually what is happening in the story. Luther enters a restaurant run by the Peace Mission members, sits at the table set for any time that Father Divine decides to dine at that location, and Luther demands liquor. A quote unquote, a large woman, an angel, tells him he cannot sit at Father Divine's table and that no alcohol is allowed. In Father Divine's peace mission movement, the angels refer to the devoted followers who adopted a sanctified lifestyle within the church. Well, Luther continues to demand liquor, and the angel becomes increasingly angry and begins throwing things at him, including pots and skillets. Luther stands on the table, He's knocking over flowers and silverware, and he steps on Father Divine's picture, which further enrages the angel. And then that angel is joined by more angels, and they beat Luther until he flees the building. He tries to call the police, but he ends up pulling the fire alarm, which brings the trucks, the fire trucks, the patrol wagons, and the police to the scene. It takes over 100 policemen to rescue Luther from the revolting angels, and he is taken to the hospital before going to jail. Luther is given a harsh sentence at trial, but the narrator states, quote, life in prison changed Luther, unquote. He never touches alcohol again after the tumultuous incident. And you can see this confrontation with the initial angel in the middle page, and then you can see the kind of riot, if you will, that is on the right hand side. The story uses humor and exaggerated action to highlight the conflict between Luther's desires and the strict rules of Father Divine's followers. And although Luther is drunk and has been, quote, drunk so long nobody could remember how he looked when he was sober, end quote, he isn't a violent man. The violence is triggered and perpetuated by the angels who are protecting expensive place settings and material things. The story concludes by noting that Luther became a peaceful and law abiding citizen, a church goer, and a senior deacon. And so you can see on this slide to the left, uh, the illustrations by Tom Feelings are depicting how Luther's story is told. It's told by a piano mover who is engaged in a debate with two other movers. Now, the debate is not about angels, it is about whether, quote, a man who has been a drunkard most of his life can straighten himself out and become a pillar of respectability and a credit to his community, end quote. And after prison, as I stated, Luther emerges a new man. He's upright. He refuses to drink anything stronger than coffee. He's a foreman of a stevedore group down on the docks. He's an officer in the Union. He's sent down south for his wife and children. He is a senior deacon at his church, and again, a peaceful, law abiding citizen. So why did my grandmother, Sarah Mack, place her bookmark at the story written by Dr. Clarke? In this case, which is not true for the first 9 books, there are no glosses written in ornate handwriting of a Black woman born left handed, but forced in school to become right handed, and would then go on to do it so beautifully in the margins of those previous titles. No folded pieces of paper with the private thoughts of an avid reader who attended some classes at Philadelphia Community College and at least a lecture or two at Temple University. There is a line in the story that reads, quote, she, meaning one of the angels, threw a pot at Luther's head like he was a long lost husband who deserted her with a house full of hungry youngins, end quote. Now, here is a picture of my grandmother, Sarah Mack. She's standing in the middle. And then there's an arrow pointing to my dad. And then there's a picture of my grandmother, and this is when she came up to Massachusetts for my graduation from UMass Amherst. Most families have secrets, and my family is no different. Sarah Mack was married to a man named Frank, and they had 8 children that survived to adulthood. But there are secrets. As the story goes, Frank Sr., struggled with alcohol, lost his job, moved with his family into his in law's 2-bedroom row home in West Philly, left his family, and then took his own life. Unlike Luther, there was no second chance for Frank Sr. But what if, like Sinue in the story from the Middle Kingdom in Kemet, a man like Frank Sr. could have exiled himself, but then lived to return to a community that welcomed him? Or like Luther did after his forced imprisonment? I am not sure what my grandmother was thinking when she encountered Dr. Clarke's story, but I do not believe that a troubled father or grandfather should shoulder the burden of an individual failure alone. It is the failure of the community. And just as it takes a village to raise a child, it takes a village to maintain the environment in which our parents and grandparents can grow into eldership. That, for me, is Dr. Clarke's lesson. Thank you, Asante Sana.